I'd like to start with a slide just rewinding a bit back to the sort of pre-COVID moment where companies were putting together their investment plans for the year. Our read of the cumulative, in a sense, effect of all those plans was that we would see a reasonably strong year for energy investment, up 2% on the previous year. I mean, that would have actually been, the strongest growth in overall global energy investment since 2014. But if we move on now to where we ended up, we have an unprecedented decline in spending across various different parts of the energy sector. That's almost $400 billion less being spent in new energy supply projects or in energy efficiency improvements this year than last year, or indeed as had been anticipated for the year as a whole. And what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen, these are our bills for energy, for different types of energy, and oil and electricity typically account for some 90% of that total. And you observe from the 2020 numbers that there's been a huge shift this year, nearly $1 trillion less spent on oil than in the past. And that means for the first time in 2020, the world's consumers are likely to be spending less on oil than they are on electricity. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you see how that $400 billion, in our view, breaks down across different parts of the energy sector. By far the largest impact on oil and gas, and both in percentage terms and in financial terms, but every part of the energy system has been affected. I'd like to just explore a little bit more the relationship between the oil and gas trajectory and the power system trajectory, because it's been quite a roller coaster for oil and gas investment over the last 10 years, but almost all downhill since 2014. And if you look at the slide, you can contrast the picture for oil and gas supply with the picture for power supply investment, which is indeed much more stable. Of course, oil and gas much more prone to traditional commodity cycles, and that's visible here. But there is more to it than that. Investment in the power sector has now risen above that for oil and gas supply for 5 years in a row. And that reflects also the fact that electricity demand has been consistently amongst the stronger elements in the overall energy demand picture. Finally, just a word on the clean energy space, because we of course track all parts of the sector. And in this final slide, we bring together all of the elements of the sort of clean energy technology. So that's including renewables inside and outside the power sector, nuclear, energy spending on energy efficiency improvements, battery storage, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Now, this picture covers the years since the conclusion of the Paris Agreement. So you might have expected that we would see a significant pickup in the amount of clean energy investment since then. In practice, what we observe is that the amount has been relatively stable at around $600 billion US dollars per year. Now, the picture it's a slightly more upbeat one than I've just presented, because of course the costs for some of those clean energy technologies, notably for solar PV and for wind power, have come down noticeably over this period. So all of those, the dollars are working harder the further you move across the screen from left to right. You're buying a lot more capacity for a given amount of investment spent. But still, this overall picture is a long way from where we would need to be in order to meet the international climate targets, the Paris Agreement, and so on. And if we click through and look at the share of clean energy spend in the total, we've been stuck at around 1/3 over recent years. We would need to get within 10 years to 2/3 of overall energy investment going into these sort of clean energy technology areas and efficiency. So there has been an uptick in 2020, or there's going to be an uptick in 2020 in our view. But that's, in a sense, that's a little bit of a mirage. It's a function of the fact that fossil fuel spending has fallen much further, it's not a sign of great health in the amount of capital going into new clean energy projects. I think I will leave it there. It's just an introduction to our thinking on some of these investment trends. A final thought is, and I'm sure we'll come to this, but overall we've seen a 6% rough decline in energy demand this year, and that's where we think we'll end up. So 6% for energy demand, but a 20% reduction in energy investment spending. And that, in our view, in different parts of the energy sector, sends out some warning signals, both about, in a sense, the adequacy and security of supply, but particularly also for the amount and the momentum behind energy transition.
And what is most striking about the impact of the crisis on global energy demand and supply, and also how the agency is seeing sort of high frequency indicators evolving across different countries and sectors in terms of demand. So maybe you can share a bit of your perspective on this.
If a country is in full lockdown, it's experiencing roughly a 25% decline in energy demand. A partial lockdown is more like a sort of 18% decline. Of course, different fuels, different technologies are affected in different ways. As you know, oil is bearing the brunt of that shock because of the curtailment in mobility and aviation. And mobility and aviation, that's roughly 60% of global demand. You know, at the height of the lockdowns in April, when more than 4 billion people worldwide were subject to some form of restriction, year-on-year demand was down around 25 million barrels a day. Now, we can discuss about how quickly that's going to pick up, and there are some signs of it picking up already. But for the year as a whole, oil demand down between 8 and 9 million barrels a day on average. On the electricity side, demand has been significantly reduced as a result of the lockdowns. One interesting aspect of that is that as electricity demand goes down, by and large, the renewables have been less affected. They have very low operating costs. They often have priority dispatch. So for many power systems, in a sense, they've had a glimpse of what it's going to be like when variable renewables, so wind and solar PV, are operating with a much higher share of overall generation. So it's in a way, these systems have been fast-forwarded 10 years into the future. And for power system operators, this has been a real-time experiment in how to handle higher shares of wind and solar. And demand has fallen for pretty much all other forms of electricity generation. And what that means is that low-carbon sources are further outstripping coal in the global electricity mix.
In which segments of the market do you expect sort of lasting effects of the crisis in terms of companies going down? Will it be in the US shale gas sector that we're going to see that, or are there other sort of countries, sectors that will be struggling and will be seeing lasting effects of the crisis?
I mean, the one you highlight, the US shale sector, undoubtedly, we're tracking that quite closely. I mean, for the US onshore as a whole, we're up to slightly more than an average of one bankruptcy a week at the moment. It's not that surprising. I mean, the shale sector was under some pressure coming into this crisis. The shale as a whole was struggling to generate free cash flow when the price was up at $50 or $60 a barrel. So in a way, it's not surprising that the outlook when we get down to 30 below at some points, these heavily leveraged shale producers are under extreme pressure.
If and when you see world oil production returning above 100 million barrels per day, and some reasoning behind such a forecast. Do you dare to give your perspective on that?
You can put together a vision for the future of oil in which video conferencing and all of these other behavioral changes have a significant impact. But let's not forget that in many parts of the world there are people joining the middle classes. They are looking for mobility. They're looking for all the services that oil provides, and so even quite extensive use of video conferencing, teleworking, you've got to set that against tens of millions of people in Africa or in parts of Asia where incomes will rise, and they may also be looking, unless there are big policy shifts, they will also be looking to oil to meet some of those service demands. So in our view, if you don't see a significant change on the policy side, then economic recovery will bring oil demand, back towards where it was, and within, and potentially even beyond.